Last but not least, for this session, I would like to introduce Dr. PamelaDouglas, a faculty member at the School of Modeling, Simulation, and Training at the University of Central Florida and researcher at UCLA. Pamela completed her PhD work with Joseph DiStefano and Mark Cohen at UCLA, and her postdoctoral work at the University College London with Carl Friston. Pamela has also been active with outreach on the African continent, including arranging equipment donations to Rwanda and networking with African scholars. Her research work focuses on applying computational neuroscience techniques to help study brain function and cognition. And today she will be speaking about interpreting deep learning for neuroscientists. Thank you, Pamela. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. What amazing talks so far. It's just been very exciting to hear everything. So let me see how to best share screens. Wonderful. Okay, is this working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. So yes, today I will be talking about how do we interpret deep learning with a specific emphasis on neuroscience and neuroimaging data. So you've probably heard about deep learning, lots of exciting advancements in the field of deep learning. There's been these fun examples from Google DeepMind, the AlphaGo example where different deep reinforcement learning techniques were able to beat the best players in Go. They can play Atari games, old video games. There's self-driving cars that are starting to happen. And there's also these amazing feats of, for example, 3D reconstruction of faces from 2D images and lots of other impressive work. Just a kind of a broad picture of what's happening with deep learning is essentially we put a variety of images or any sort of feature can go into a model. Convolutional deep learning neural networks do very well with images as inputs, but you can also put in DNA sequences, text, social media data, sounds, any sort of input. I saw a hand come up. Is there a problem with the presentation? No.
The presentation looks fine. You're in presenter mode. You can see your slides on the side, but yeah, it looks fine.
Okay, great. So I found this fun animal picture, for example, from Nigeria. I have no idea what that is, so someone can maybe tell me later. This is a very exciting new advancement just in the past year with deep learning, which is this ability to predict protein folding. So of course we have DNA sequences and then the alternative splicing that takes place. And then we have mRNA sequences, which are then read out with ribosomes into this amino acid sequence. And from the amino acid sequence, one of the big challenges has been, how do we predict protein folding? Because so many different things can take place between the amino acid sequence and the 3D structure of the protein itself. Disulfide bonds, forming and being cut by different enzymes. And it's a very complex process. And then from there, eventually, how do we predict function? But it seems as though a variety of deep learning techniques, this is from Google DeepMind using this AlphaFold technique, they've been able to predict protein folding quite well. So that's a very, very exciting new advancement from the deep learning world. And hopefully in the future, we'll soon be able to predict function. That would be also very exciting. From my own group, I've mostly used neuroimaging data to make a variety of different predictions. So predicting neurological disease such as ADHD using functional modular organization. I've also replicated that on a variety of different data sets, predicting autism spectral disorders with functional connectivity derived from functional MRI data. This was an interesting part of my PhD work, which was predicting religious beliefs, as well as autobiographical data. and behavioral responses using independent components derived from fMRI data. So these are just the types of inputs that were put into the deep learning models. And recently, this is fun work that I collaborated on with Leo Moore, who's also participated in some of the trend events. We were able to make predictions about empathy using self-other resonance networks in the brain, again, using functional MRI data. But this functional modular organization one is kind of fun because it sort of rests on this graph theory method. And more recently, I've worked with one of my graduate students, Farzad Farahani, and we've examined the spread of COVID variants using graph theoretic networks in combination with deep learning and prediction techniques. And essentially what we found in this paper is that COVID spread follows a small world neural network. So that's kind of an exciting finding in terms of if you want to do more increased genetic and genotype surveillance and also potentially make some predictions about what's going to happen with a new variant, where is it going to spread, and also just thinking about how this prediction intertwines with what we know about active and passive immunity, as well as where new variants are likely to pop up. And surprisingly, it seems as though a lot of the new variants don't pop up necessarily in big hubs like New York City, but more on the edges of the network or not edges, but more obscure, less connected parts of the network. So that's kind of also an interesting finding. And there's potentially some interesting thoughts about that. So deep learning people love to have these funny problems. There's a classic one, blueberry muffin versus chihuahua. There's this another great data set, dog or mop. So I felt as though we needed to show a fun example here. So if we have a bunch of training data, say images of dogs and mops, we put it through a deep learning model, and then we get some accuracy, say depending upon what type of model we're using, how many hidden layers in the neural network, etc. So if we do this, we have this output. We have say a new test case. This is a fun dog mop thing here. We put it through this network, and we find out, hey, it worked. But deep learning neural networks are often thought of as black box models in the sense that we don't really understand what's happening there. And so I asked this question: if it works, should we care how it's working? Do we actually care? If we're just passing something through and it works, do we care? Sometimes the answer is no. A lot of us drive cars and few of us understand how they work, and that's just fine. We have mechanics and they can help us. But with deep learning, I think there's some very serious reasons why we should care what's happening internally. So one reason why we should care is this issue of verifying fairness. And so there's been a number of papers that have come out to show that occasionally deep learning models are biased. So this is a fun one from a group at Berkeley called Women Also Snowboard. So it turned out that in their study, most snowboarders were just labeled as males. So there's some techniques to try and overcome systematic bias that these models introduce at times. Because some models do tend to exaggerate bias. And it turns out that unfortunately, if you balance your data set, meaning say, for example, 50% male snowboarders, 50% female snowboarders, it doesn't seem to be enough. The models will still sometimes find and propagate these systematic biases. We also would like to make sure that the models are reliable. So there have been some accidents with self-driving cars, and this is also some very interesting work just using stop signs and showing that a tiny bit of graffiti, it doesn't even have to be that obvious, can very confuse the deep learning algorithms if we're not careful. So we really need to kick the tires, so to speak, and make sure that the models are actually working on a whole variety of different cases before we can really have widespread adoption. And when we know what the models are doing, it also helps us build trust. It helps us understand and verify that the proper problem representation has indeed been instantiated within the model. And it ensures that the model has learned the right concept and is not operating on something spurious related to that particular training data set. And that most certainly has happened. And I'll show you more in just a moment. But ultimately, yes, we want to wish that we would like to ensure that an input pattern essentially serves the purpose or the expected function, which is to convey information about a particular class downstream. So if you're interested in some of the intricacies of feature fallacy, which is when you're misinterpreting a particular aspect of the model, I would recommend checking out this paper here. And finally, if we can interpret the models, we can keep humans in the loop. And so that's very exciting because maybe deep learning models can actually teach us something. So here's an example, and this did use a combination of image processing as well as domain knowledge. But my brother is a radiologist. He actually teaches radiology in Uganda, which is fun. But he told me that for a long time, there's been this general wisdom that radiologists, when they're looking at a brain image and they see a tumor, that they should really only examine the borders of the tumor to determine whether it's aggressive and they need to take it out, or whether it's just kind of a benign tumor and it's not problematic and they don't need to operate. But there's this nice fun study here that showed if you use convolutional neural network predictions based on these texture features from within the tumor, you can actually learn quite a bit and predict survival of a variety of different cerebral gliomas, for example. And so that's something that we actually learned from a deep learning model. So keeping humans in the loop may have some important implications if we can trust the models, and if more importantly, if we can trust the explanations or the explainable AI methods. So there are many explainable AI techniques and they answer different questions. So I'm just going to kind of go through the broad classes of explainable AI techniques. So the first type is what I like to call the archetypal methods. And these ask this question: what is a prototypical example of something, of Y, whatever it is? So if you're in the medical world, you might ask, what is a prototypical example of a cerebral glioma? You may also wish to, and that's very useful for training purposes and teaching. So you have different prototypical examples of perhaps rare cases and rare variants. So some examples of algorithms that do this or could answer this question are activation maximization, as well as generative methods such as generative adversarial networks, which have about 1 million memes on the internet. So if you just Google GANs, you'll see some very fun examples of how those have been applied to different data sets. But the most common, I think, of these explainable AI methods essentially ask this question. They're post hoc methods, meaning that the model has already been trained, it's already produced its prediction, and now we want to somehow map back through the model back onto the input generally to ask this question: which aspects of our input provide evidence for something in particular? So if you're looking at a brain image, you might ask, which aspect of the brain image provides evidence that it is or is not a glioma, a tumor? And so in theory, if this worked very well, the algorithm may very well map back to the actual tumor. And there may be some surrounding areas as well that we may eventually learn are somehow indicators that a specific condition is taking place. Most of these methods generally use Well, the early methods were things like sensitivity analysis or multiplying by the gradient times the input. Those have pretty much, we've moved on from those because they fail quite readily. So right now, the field is generally focused on either redistribution or decomposition methods. So again, these try to map back through the model after it's been trained, generally onto the input, but importantly, map back to some sort of format where humans can actually interpret the input. So generally with images, it's very clear, we just map back onto an image. But with sounds or other forms of inputs, sometimes it's a little bit tricky to figure out what are we mapping back to. So that is something to consider. But unfortunately, even some of these very sophisticated, methods still sometimes fail on some very classic data perturbations. So there's a great paper by Kindermans, for example, that shows that you can have the exact same model essentially, and just shift the input. So just add like a constant value to it. And it turns out you can still have the exact same predictions. So each input will still produce the same prediction. However, the relevance or the heat maps where we would like to interpret the data are changed. So in this sense, it's possible in many cases to alter the explanation without altering the predictions. So that's a little bit problematic if different parts of the image can be, in theory, used to make a prediction. It's hard to converge onto something that we can actually interpret. There are some methods that do averaging across lots of trials, and those seem to work better, but it's still sort of a nascent field in many ways. Lastly, we have this functional interpretation, which is to think of these networks as a model for information processing in the human brain. And so one way to do this is to visualize each layer and to see what's happening and try to infer some sort of mechanistic aspect of the algorithm and how that might relate to the brain. And so there's many parallels between deep learning neural networks and the human brain. Deep learning neural networks or feed-forward networks, for example, might be a good model of the cerebellum, because as it turns out, the cerebellum is mostly feed-forward. You can also have recurrent computations, many different parallels between the number of weights, because intelligent systems are expected to require many different weights and complex representations. So it's possible that deep learning neural networks may provide insight into computation in the human brain. So one thing that seemed very exciting at first, I'm seeing hands come up. I'm not sure if that's because of time, but I only have a couple more slides. So perhaps if that's the case, maybe just hold off. It turns out that if you visualize, there's been some nice talks on the visual system. So you probably know that V1 in the human brain has these nice edge detection Gabor filters. Many different deep learning models also use those as part of their first layer of processing. And so that's exciting in some sense, because it seems to appear very similar to what's happening in the human brain. On the other hand, there's lots of different models that all learn these Gabor filters. So really that doesn't help us narrow down which one is more biologically plausible. So with all of this going on, this is my current work, which is trying to figure out sanity checks for heat maps. I'm just going to tick through a quick example. So this is kind of a fun, very famous paper, which showed that if you had a model trained, it could predict a panda with, say, 57% confidence. But if you add just a tiny bit of noise, which is completely imperceptible to most humans, the image on the right shows the image with noise, it can not only change the classification itself in terms of going from a panda to a gibbon, but it also boosts the confidence. So this tells me that there's still something that we have to learn about the human visual system and how that can inform our deep learning models. There's also some fun papers that show that, for example, you might think your model's really working very well, But in this case, they found out that their horse classification versus all of these other categories was relying on the copyright symbol being highly correlated with the horse. And so that is also a fun example. So my recent work is working on things like didactic perturbations. So teaching the model what's going on and making sure that the model, the heat maps, identify the teaching signal. So in this case, we used a panda as a teaching signal that correlated perfectly with the accuracy. And what we found was that still many of the explainable AI methods were failing. And so that's disappointing, but also exciting because it means that there's a lot of room for growth in this field. So yes, conclusions, there's many desirable properties for these relevance heat map methods. I think probably the most important for the greater biological and medical field is that we have a unified explanation that's unabridged, that shows us everything that the model's using and leveraging to make its prediction. And subsequently, some way to determine if part of what it's using is just noise cancellation, because that is also a big factor in deep learning models. So just in conclusion, great care should be taken when you're interpreting your deep learning neural networks. Please test out multiple models because there's no free lunch, and there's also this feature fallacy issue. Transparency methods are still a very active area of research, and we are in need for sure of more complex benchmark data sets, specifically not for the prediction itself, but for the interpretation process. And we also need sanity checks to make sure that our own transparency methods are also trustworthy. And so I just wanted to end very quickly with saying that you don't need a big machine, you don't need an MRI machine, you don't need a microscope. All of these data, there's so much data online. The Human Connectome Project, if you are interested in brain imaging data, has thousands of subjects. This NITRIC has also lots and lots and lots of data from EEG, fMRI, biology. Kaggle is a great website that has all kinds of data from taxi cab driver movement to whatever you can think of, real estate prices. There's tons of open data sets for COVID, genotyping, etc. And this makes it something that anyone can really jump in and be a part of, because all you really need is a computer and a little bit of knowledge. Hopefully a deep knowledge, but some knowledge in coding, and you can start and get started. I attend oftentimes the NeurIPS, which is a big AI meeting, and I've seen each year a growing contingency from Africa. And it's really exciting that a lot of African researchers are starting to participate in the big AI meeting. And you can go in person or you can go virtually. So it would be great to have some increased participation there. So it's easy to get involved. And I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. And thank you so much to Renee, Dr. Hartig, who is just amazing for organizing. And yes, I will happily stick around for questions if there is time.